The wind carried a sharpness that bit through cloth and skin alike. The widow's back ached as if the ground itself had pressed its hatred into her bones. She knelt in the dust, lashes cutting lines that time would never smooth away. Her breath came in shudders, the sound swallowed by the barren plains that stretched without mercy. The sky, colorless and wide, did not bend to her sorrow. No hand reached for her. No word softened the sting of what had been done. Only silence, broken by the faint rasp of wind through brittle grass, bore witness to her ruin. She pressed her forehead against the earth, its chill indifferent to her trembling, and for the first time in her life she feared that even God had turned his face away. She remembered when her world had not yet been stripped to nothing. There had once been a house, rough-hewn but strong, the smell of bread still in her hands as her husband laughed by the fire. His boots had been worn, his shoulders broad, his voice carrying steadiness through their lean years. When fever took him, the village turned its gaze upon her, whispering of her barren womb, of the shame of a woman who could not bear a son. In their eyes, she had been judged, her worth reduced to silence and a hollow home. The memory of his touch, the sound of his voice, were all she had been allowed to keep, and even those now burned like a wound inside her. The blows had not ended her life, though perhaps they were meant to. Each strike had drawn not only blood but the certainty that she was unwanted, a ghost permitted to walk only because death had not yet claimed her. She stumbled now across the open land, ribs aching with every shallow breath. The sun sagged low, a dull red bleeding into the horizon. She thought of water, of rest, but her body carried her forward as if it no longer belonged to her. The shape of a homestead rose out of the distance, pale smoke lifting against the evening sky. A horse, tethered to the fence, snorted as she neared, its dark eyes catching the frailty of her steps. She swayed, knees buckling, but the sound of children's laughter held her upright. A boy's voice, high and insistent, carried through the dusk. A girl's giggle followed, sharp and sudden. The world tilted, her vision blurred, and she found herself crumpled before the wooden gate, the earth cool against her cheek. He saw her there, slumped like a rag left to weather. The rancher set down the pail in his hand and strode forward, his children pausing in their play to watch. His face, stern from years of toil, softened when he knelt beside her. He did not ask who she was, nor why her dress was torn and stained. He only placed a steady hand beneath her shoulder, lifting her with the ease of a man who had carried burdens heavier than his own heart. The widow tried to speak, but her voice fractured into silence. His eyes met hers, calm and certain, and for the first time in days, perhaps years, she did not feel judged. Inside the cabin, firelight drew shadows across the walls. The children hovered near, curious yet cautious. He laid her gently upon the bed, covering her with a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. The warmth bled into her skin, fighting the chill that had taken root. She closed her eyes, hearing the quiet murmur of his voice as he reassured his children. Though her body throbbed with pain, something within her loosened a knot of fear, of endless wandering. Perhaps here, for a moment, she was not a ghost. Perhaps here, the silence that had followed her might begin to crack. Outside, night settled across the plains, stars scattering like distant promises. She lay beneath the blanket, half awake, listening to the sounds of a life not yet her own, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of children, the low timbre of a man who did not flinch at her presence. The weight of her wounds did not vanish, but the room held her as the world outside never had. She turned her face into the pillow, breathing in the faint scent of home, and felt the first fragile thread of belonging tighten around her heart. Morning returned with the pale color of ash, and with it, the ache that mapped her back like a cruel handwriting. She rolled to her side, each breath a measure of what remained. The door creaked. He stepped in with a basin and a folded cloth. The children hovered at the threshold, their eyes uncertain, like colts learning the fence. He said nothing at first. The cloth touched her skin, warm and steady, and the sting rose bright as lightning. She gasped, bracing for the old insult, the old command to endure it alone. None came. Only his quiet patience as he cleaned each welt, as if he were mending a torn piece of sky. "Eat," he said after a time, setting a bowl near her. The spoon shook in her hand. not from fear alone, but from the memory of hunger layered upon itself, like rings in a felled tree. The boy took a careful step forward. "Pa says you can have my biscuit." His sister elbowed him, small and fierce. "Ours," she corrected, placing the bread in the widow's palm with solemn ceremony. The widow's throat tightened. She forced the first bite past the knot, then the next, and with each mouthful she felt something inside her unclench, as if the body's stubborn will were whispering to the heart that living might still be possible. Pain loosened its grip by inches. She tried to stand, and her legs trembled, so he offered an arm without making her feel the weight of it. Outside, the day went on with its blunt tasks. Wood to split, water to haul, a fence line to walk. He told the children to mind the chores and left the door open for the air to move through. She watched the way he carried himself, the economy of motion carved by years of necessity. When he bent to lift a saddle, the muscle in his forearm flexed, and she thought of a time before all this, when a man's body had meant shelter rather than threat. The thought startled her, like a bird flushed from brush. She forced her gaze to the floorboards and breathed until the trembling eased. Later he returned with a needle and thread. "These seams," he said, gesturing to the torn hem of her dress. "They will catch on splinters." His hands, rough as river stones, moved with care, stitching the fabric while she sat very still, remembering other hands that had not known gentleness. The memory rose unbidden, the circle of faces hard as winter, the lesson they claimed to teach with each lash. She had counted in her mind to keep from making a sound. When she reached the number that shamed her most, the world went pale and soundless, and afterward she could not remember how she came to the open land. Now, in the hush of the small room, the thread whisked through cloth, and she realized she had been holding her breath. "You can stay," he said at last, without looking up, "until you are steady." She nodded, though the word stay trembled in her like a note sustained too long. She did not belong anywhere. A woman judged barren belonged nowhere at all. Yet the children's small footsteps and the warmth of the stove argued against the verdict written on her skin. When the girl asked if she could braid the widow's hair, she bowed her head and let the little hands work. The tug of each strand, the simple order of it, felt like the opposite of pain. Days formed a thin seam of routine. She folded blankets, washed tin plates, moved slowly, and did not complain when motion lit a slow fire along her back. He showed her the gentle mare and the stubborn mule, naming them with a plain fondness that made the animals seem like kin. She learned the calls he used for the chickens and how he checked the wind for weather. When she insisted on hauling water, he watched but did not stop her. His restraint became its own kind of shelter, a roof made of quiet. At dusk, she sat on the stoop with the children while he walked the edge of the property. The boy leaned against her arm as if he had always known its shape. The girl practiced whistling and failed nobly. The widow traced a knot in the step with her thumb and tried to recall a future. Once there had been a promise, spoken at a kitchen table by a man whose laughter lived now only in memory. She had believed the world might forgive her shortcomings. The world had not. But the sound of boots returning at night, the way he paused to look at the sky before coming inside, suggested another lesson, that mercy often came without witness, without trumpet or decree, carried in the ordinary acts of decent people. On the 7th morning she woke before the others and stepped outside. The sky was the color of tin. She lifted the bucket and walked to the well, testing her strength against the distance. The first pull wrenched a groan from her ribs, but the second found a rhythm. When she turned, he was there, arms crossed, not interfering. "You should have called," he said, voice mild. "I needed to know," she answered, surprised by the firmness of her tone. He nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement of a pact forming between them. That evening, a wagon rattled up the lane. The widow went still, the soup ladle heavy in her hand. On the seat sat 2 men from the village, their hats low, their mouths tight with the certainty of their cause. The children drifted behind her like minnows hiding in the shadow of a rock. He stepped out and stood with the quiet of a man who does not confuse gentleness with surrender. "We heard you took someone in," the taller man said. "She is a trouble that belongs to us." Belongs. The word scraped bone. She felt the old urge to fold in on herself, to make her body narrow as a reed. He did not move. "There is no trouble here," he said. only work, and people doing it. The men's eyes slid past him to where she stood, measuring her like a debt. The shorter one spat. A woman who refuses the purpose given her has no place. He tapped the sideboard of the wagon. Come along. Her breath shortened. The room dimmed around the edges. She waited for him to step aside, to return her to the road that never ended. Instead, he said simply, "Number." The word was calm as water and adamant as stone. His children came to either side of the widow, small shoulders squared, as if they understood that standing near someone can be a kind of truth. The taller man's jaw worked. "You defy the will of your neighbors." "My neighbors," he said, "are the ones I share bread and weather with. You have brought neither." The silence that followed was tight as rope. At last the men clicked their tongues, and the wagon creaked backward, dust lifting from the ruts like a hesitant prayer. The widow held the ladle until her hand hurt, and then set it down with care, as one might lay a fragile relic to rest. After the wagon disappeared, he did not look at her with triumph. He only asked, "Are you steady?" She found that she was, in a way she had not been in years. Something had shifted, a beam set true. "I am," she said. The children resumed their chatter as if nothing remarkable had occurred. Yet everything had. Night gathered at the windows, and the wind hummed like a low hymn. She tasted salt, and realized it was not from blood but from tears that did not burn. The days that followed settled like stones into the foundation of something new. Work called each dawn, and she rose to meet it, her body still tender but her will stitched together with quiet resolve. She scrubbed the wooden table until the grain shone, swept the hearth clean, and learned the rhythm of the ranch, the crack of kindling, the creak of the water pump, the chorus of chickens announcing morning. The children clung to her with the innocent certainty that she belonged, their laughter trailing her as she moved about the yard. He spoke little, but his silence was not the silence of judgment. It was steady, companionable, as if he understood words were not always the truest currency. Still, moments surfaced when his reserve faltered. One evening, while mending a harness by lamplight, he told her his wife had died 3 winters past, fever burning through her before he could fetch the doctor. His voice caught only once, on the word fever, but the pause spoke more than pages could. "It left me with the 2 of them," he said, nodding toward the children asleep by the fire. "They've needed more than I could give." Her eyes lingered on the curve of the boy's cheek, the loosened braid of the girl. She knew the hollow of loss, the ache of trying to fill silence with one's own breath. She whispered, "They have your steadiness." He looked at her then, the kind of look that pressed deeper than skin. She turned away, pretending to fuss with the hem of her skirt, though warmth spread through her chest in a way she could neither deny nor name. With spring's thaw came longer days and heavier labor. She insisted on helping mend fences, her fingers raw from wire and wood. He tried once to stop her, but she squared her shoulders and said, "If I am to stay, I will carry my share." He studied her face and saw not weakness, but a stubborn light. "Then stay near," he said. Together they stretched the line across the field, their shadows long against the grass. The children brought water, proud of their role, and the day ended with all of them eating cornbread and beans under a sky swirled with violet. Still, the weight of judgment did not vanish. One afternoon, while trading for flour in town, she caught the sharp eyes of women who whispered as she passed. Their words rode the air like nettles, barren, shamed, unfit. Her hand trembled on the sack she carried, but she did not falter. Later, back at the ranch, he noticed her silence. "What was said?" he asked. She shook her head. "Nothing I have not heard before." His jaw tightened. "You are not their measure." That night she sat awake long after the children slept, watching the embers glow faintly in the stove. She thought of leaving, of sparing him the burden of her shadow. Yet when she looked at the door, her body would not move. Something bound her here more tightly than fear could unfasten. Perhaps it was the children's trust, or the steadiness in his eyes when he faced down the wagon men. Perhaps it was the way the land itself, harsh as it was, seemed to accept her as she learned its patterns. The conflict broke on a day when the cattle wandered too close to the neighbor's line. She followed him out with the children trailing, their small boots stirring dust. The neighbor, a broad man with a voice like gravel, accused her of bringing ruin to the land with her cursed presence. "Bad luck follows barren women," he spat, his hand drifting toward the rifle slung at his side. The rancher stepped between them, his stance calm but unyielding. "She is under my roof," he said. "What harm comes to her comes to me." The man sneered. "Then you'll both pay the price." His threat hung like thunder, but the widow felt a fire rise in her chest. For years she had bent, silent, beneath blows and words alike. But not now. She stepped forward, her voice clear, steady. "I have borne your cruelty and your lies. I will not carry them further." The neighbor's eyes widened, caught off guard by the defiance of a woman who had once been forced to her knees. The rancher's hand hovered near his belt, but no weapon was drawn. Instead, the children clutched the widow's skirts, their trust a shield stronger than steel. The neighbor spat into the dirt and muttered a curse before turning back toward his land. Dust swallowed him, leaving behind only silence and the sound of the widow's breath, fierce and unbroken. That evening, the rancher spoke softly by the fire. "You did not have to face him." She shook her head. "I did, or I would never belong here." He studied her, the lamplight carving lines of fatigue and strength across his face. "Then you belong," he said simply. She looked at him, at the children drowsing in their blankets, at the walls that now held her heartbeat, and she felt it, the slow, certain root of family pushing through the soil of her pain. She reached for his hand, tentative at first, then firmer. His fingers closed around hers with a steadiness that promised no lash, no abandonment, only the quiet labor of building something that could last. Summer pressed itself upon the land with heat that shimmered above the fields and bent the horizon into wavering line. Sweat slicked the widow's brow as she worked beside the children, pulling weeds from the garden while cicadas droned their endless hymn. Her back still bore the map of scars, but she no longer felt only their weight. Each movement, each task completed, laid another stone over the ruins of her past, building something firmer. When she glanced up and saw him at the barn, shoulders squared against the sun, she felt a steadiness that no whisper of judgment could undo. One evening, after the chores were finished and supper was cleared, he brought out an old fiddle from a trunk. Its varnish was dulled by years of dust, but when the bow touched strings, a low, trembling song filled the cabin. The children swayed, clapping in uneven rhythm. The widow sat still, her hands folded tight, as if afraid to disturb the fragile beauty. He caught her gaze and gave a faint nod, coaxing her to breathe with the music. Slowly, the tightness in her chest eased, and she found herself tapping her foot, almost smiling. When the song ended, silence settled rich and full, like soil ready for seed. Days grew into weeks, and their work carved a rhythm of trust. She learned to milk the cow without flinching at its sudden shifts. She walked the pastures with the children, teaching them to gather herbs her mother had once shown her, simple remedies for fevers and cuts. In these small acts, she felt the ghost of usefulness, the return of a dignity long stolen. One afternoon, while she mended a torn shirt of his by the fire, he paused in the doorway. His voice was rougher than usual. "You make this house lighter." She looked down quickly, the needle shaking, because the words carried more weight than she was ready to bear. But doubt lingered like a shadow at the edge of her vision. She often wondered if her presence brought him more burden than comfort. The stares in town, the whispers carried on wind, were not easily ignored. Once, while fetching salt, she overheard a woman sneer that the rancher must be desperate to shelter a barren widow, doomed to leave no legacy. The words pierced sharper than any lash. She returned home with the sack clutched too tightly, her silence heavy through the evening meal. He noticed, of course, but did not press. Only when the children had gone to bed did he speak. "You believe them," he said quietly. She tried to answer, but the words stuck. His eyes softened. "Legacy is not only blood. It is what we choose to give." Conflict found them in harsher form when a drought settled in, the earth cracking open beneath their boots. Water ran thin, and neighbors grew bitter. One dusk, men gathered near the well, demanding she be sent away, claiming her cursed womb had called the blight upon their fields. She stood frozen, the old fear rushing back, the taste of dust and shame thick in her mouth. The rancher stepped forward, his voice like iron driven deep. This land has no curse but your cruelty. She stays. The children stood behind him, clutching the widow's hands, their faces pale but unyielding. The men muttered, spat, and left, leaving behind the echo of a war not fully ended. That night, by lantern light, she wept quietly into her hands. He sat beside her, not speaking until the tears eased. Then he said, "They cannot see past their hunger and fear, but I do." She lifted her head, meeting his eyes. In them she found no pity, only recognition, as if he had been waiting all along for her to stand in that place. His hand rested over hers, rough and steady. "This house is yours if you want it," he said. Her breath hitched, not from pain but from the sudden, terrifying swell of hope. The following morning, the sun rose red through the haze of dust. She moved through the cabin, laying out bread and coffee, her hands steady though her heart pounded. The children tumbled from their beds, laughter chasing shadows from the corners. When he entered, brushing grit from his hat, their eyes met across the small room. Something passed between them then, wordless, undeniable, a vow not spoken in church or written on paper, but stitched into the very air they shared. Outside, the land groaned under drought, but inside the cabin, the widow felt something bloom. She was no longer the woman cast aside, beaten into silence. She was part of a family, chosen and choosing in return. And when the children pressed close to her, their small hands clinging, she knew the truth of what he had said. Legacy is not only blood, it is love endured, love given, love made flesh in the shelter of a home. Autumn came with a brittle sky, the air sharp with the scent of harvested grain. The widow wrapped her shawl tight as she walked the fields with the children, their laughter chasing through rows of stubbled stalks. Her scars ached in the chill, but the pain no longer defined her. Each step beside them was proof that she had not been broken, only tempered. The rancher worked ahead, repairing a section of fence, and when he turned and caught her watching, his smile, small, almost shy, struck deeper than any vow spoken from a pulpit. One evening, as dusk slid into night, he brought her to the edge of the property where an old oak stood, its branches reaching like a cathedral roof. He spoke of his father, who had planted it as a boy, and of his wife, who used to sit beneath its shade with their newborn daughter. His voice carried the weight of grief, but also the strange peace of memory preserved. "I thought this tree would outlast all of us," he said. She touched the rough bark, feeling its scars and ridges. "It still might," she whispered, and for the first time she felt included in a story larger than her own sorrow. But the past is never buried so easily. Word came from town that a council had been called, whispers turning into threats. Some wanted her cast out, convinced her presence drew hardship. The rancher's jaw tightened when he heard, but he said only, "We will face them." Fear clawed at her ribs, the old terror of hands raised, voices condemning. That night she could not sleep, hearing again the count of lashes, the jeers of neighbors. Yet in the stillness, she felt the warmth of a small body pressing against her, his daughter, who had crawled into her bed without a word. The girl's breath was steady, trusting. The widow gathered her close, and something in her heart hardened into resolve. The meeting came on a gray morning. Villagers gathered in the square, their eyes sharp as knives. She stood beside the rancher, shoulders back, though her knees trembled. Accusations flew about drought, about barrenness, about curses whispered in the dark. The widow swallowed hard, her hands shaking, until the boy tugged at her skirt. "Speak, Ma," he whispered, the words spilling out, unbidden, uncoached. It steadied her like nothing else could. She lifted her voice, low but clear. "I have endured more cruelty than any curse could bring. If suffering were a mark of shame, then every scar upon my back would condemn you all as well. But shame does not bind me, nor will it bind this family." Silence stretched, taut as wire. The rancher placed his hand upon hers, grounding her. "She is mine," he said, voice ringing like iron struck on anvil. "And these children are hers as much as they are mine. We will not be moved." Some turned away, muttering, unwilling to challenge the steel in his tone. Others lingered, faces troubled, but none stepped forward to drag her away. At last the gathering broke apart, leaving only dust swirling where judgment had once stood. When they returned home, she collapsed into a chair, trembling with the weight of what she had done. He knelt before her, lifting her chin until her eyes met his. "You faced them," he said, "and they will not forget it." Her tears fell, not from despair but from the strange, fierce relief of standing unbroken. The children clung to her, and in their embrace she felt the fullness of belonging, stronger than any decree of neighbors or counsel. That evening the oak outside caught the last fire of sunset, its branches burning gold against the darkening sky. The widow stood with him beneath its shade, the children racing around them in widening circles. He reached into his pocket and pressed something into her hand, a simple ring, rough-edged but true. "Not for their sake," he said softly, "but for ours." Her fingers closed around it, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Yes." The cabin glowed warm against the encroaching dark, laughter spilling through its walls. The widow stepped inside, her hand entwined with his, the children already calling for her to join their game. The scars upon her back would never vanish, but they no longer told the end of her story. They told the beginning of another one rooted in choice, in love, in the stubborn defiance of despair. And when night came, settling soft and complete, she lay down in a home that was no longer borrowed, no longer fragile, but hers forever.